Hey guys! Tonight we're standing at the very edge of memory. In a place where the ground beneath your feet still doesn't quite remember being walked on. You're here in Ireland before Ireland has a name. Before maps. Before anyone thought to complain about the weather in writing. The air is cool and damp. The kind that clings gently to your skin. And the land around you is a patchwork of forests, bogs, and open coastline, humming softly with insects and distant birds. You can almost smell wet earth and salt from the sea. And honestly, if you were dropped here without modern gear, a grocery store, or even a decent jacket, Ben Chak Kong Song Noi Do, you probably wouldn't survive very long. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're still standing there, breathing slowly, as the story begins to drift backward, farther than written words. Farther than kings or saints. Back to a time when Ireland is just emerging from beneath massive sheets of ice. Around 10,000 years ago, the glaciers have finally retreated, leaving behind scraped rock, cold lakes, and a landscape that looks a bit like it's still stretching after a long sleep. You imagine the silence then, broken only by wind and water, and maybe the distant call of an animal you don't recognize. The first people arrive quietly. No dramatic invasion. No flags planted in the soil. You picture small groups of hunter-gatherers moving cautiously along the coast. Likely arriving by simple boats from Britain. This is one of those widely accepted historical events. The peopling of Ireland after the last ice age. They bring almost nothing with them except stone tools, knowledge, and an impressive tolerance for damp conditions. A lesser-known fact is that Ireland ends up with fewer large predators than neighboring regions, no bears, no wolves for long periods, which subtly shapes how these early people live, hunt, and sleep without constantly fearing something with fangs. As you follow them inland, you notice how light their footprint is. They don't build cities. They don't carve monuments. They move with the seasons, living off fish, deer, wild plants, and shellfish. You can almost hear the crunch of gravel under bare feet. The soft scrape of stone blades against wood. Historians still debate exactly how large these early populations were and how long they stayed in one place. Mostly because they were very good at not leaving much behind. In a way, they're the ultimate minimalists. No clutter. No mess. No archaeological receipts. Time slides forward, as gently as a tide. You feel the rhythm change when farming arrives around 4000 BCE. This is another major, well-known shift. The Neolithic Revolution reaches Ireland. Suddenly, people are clearing forests, planting crops, and keeping animals. The land begins to look less wild, more shaped by human hands. You imagine the repetitive comfort of routine, planting, harvesting, repairing simple homes. like the world's slowest, muddiest to-do list. And then there are the stone monuments. You stand before massive structures like passage tombs and stone circles. Their rocks stacked with care and intention. Newgrange is the most famous example, older than Stonehenge and even the Egyptian pyramids, which always sounds like a historical flex Ireland doesn't brag about enough. A strange and fascinating detail is that Newgrange is aligned with the winter solstice sunrise, flooding its inner chamber with light for just a few minutes each year. People without metal tools, calculators, or Google Maps somehow managed cosmic-level precision. Historians still argue over whether these monuments were tombs, temples, calendars, or all of the above, because humans love multifunctional buildings, even 5,000 years ago. As you drift through this era, you sense that life is still fragile. A bad harvest, a harsh winter, or disease can erase entire communities. Yet there's also patience here. Generations pass with little visible change, and time feels thicker, slower, like it has weight. You almost start to relax into it. No notifications, no deadlines, no emails asking if you saw the last email. Eventually, metal arrives. Bronze tools and weapons appear around 2500 BCE, marking another turning point everyone agrees on. Ireland becomes surprisingly rich in gold during this period, and you imagine skilled hands shaping delicate ornaments, lunalae, torques, bracelets, objects made not for survival but for status, beauty, and maybe a bit of showing off. One odd fact is that many of these gold objects are found buried in bogs or rivers, possibly as ritual offerings. Historians still debate whether this was religious devotion, symbolic wealth storage, or just ancient people being very bad at remembering where they buried things. You feel society slowly becoming more layered. Some people clearly have more power than others now. There are leaders, warriors, craftspeople. Conflict simmers just beneath the surface, though it hasn't yet exploded into the epic wars Ireland will later be famous for. The land itself seems to be watching, absorbing footsteps, secrets, and stories it will carry forward for thousands of years. As this section fades, you notice how all of it, hunters, farmers, stone builders, metalworkers, forms a quiet foundation. No names, no dates carved into memory, just a deep sense of continuity. You're still walking forward, but the ground beneath you now feels lived in, claimed, remembered, and somewhere ahead, you can almost hear new voices approaching, bringing language, myth, and a very strong opinion about cattle. You keep moving, slowly, letting the past hum around you. As the story drifts onward into the next age, you don't notice the shift at first. That's how these things usually happen. One day you're walking through familiar clearings, past farms that feel settled and predictable, and the next, the world seems quietly rearranged. Stone is still everywhere, but now it's being lifted with a different kind of confidence. You feel it in your legs as you walk uphill toward another monument. Another careful arrangement of rock that suggests long-term planning and even longer patience. This is the age when stone circles, court tombs, and standing stones multiply across the island. A well-known historical reality is that Neolithic Ireland becomes densely marked with ritual landscapes. You imagine yourself tracing the grooves in a massive stone with your fingertips, feeling the chill locked inside it. These structures aren't practical in the everyday sense. No one's storing grain here or hiding from the rain, but they matter deeply. They're anchors in time. One strange and lesser-known detail is that many of these monuments are positioned not just for the sun, but for sound. Some chambers subtly amplify voices, making chants resonate in a way that feels intentional, almost theatrical. Historians still debate whether this was deliberate acoustic design or a lucky accident that later gained symbolic meaning. You picture gatherings at dusk. Small fires flicker. Smoke hangs low in the air. People move slowly, deliberately, like they're afraid of interrupting something invisible. There's no written language yet, so everything important lives in memory, in stories repeated until they become smooth and familiar. Like a favorite song you don't remember learning. You sense that forgetting is dangerous here. Memory is survival. The land itself feels involved. Bogs swallow objects and preserve them. Rivers receive offerings. Trees mark boundaries and sacred spaces. You pass a standing stone that might mark a burial, a meeting place, or simply a reminder that something important happened here once. The frustrating truth, for modern scholars and for you standing here half asleep, is that we can't be sure. Historians still argue about whether these stones represent gods, ancestors, territorial claims, or all three layered together. Ambiguity is part of the atmosphere, like mist that refuses to burn off. As farming continues, communities grow slightly larger, but life is still local. You don't travel far. Most people never will. Your entire world fits within a few valleys, a coastline, a handful of paths worn into the earth. And yet, ideas travel, techniques spread, styles of monuments appear in multiple regions, suggesting communication across distances that feel large when you're walking them barefoot. It's a reminder that even without roads or wheels, humans are excellent at sharing what matters to them, especially when it involves heavy stones and spiritual significance. There's a quiet humor in imagining the logistics. Someone, at some point, confidently says, "Yes, let's move that rock," and everyone else somehow agrees. No cranes, no pulleys, just teamwork, persistence, and probably a lot of grumbling. If nothing else, this era proves that peer pressure has always been a powerful force in human history. As night settles, you sense that these monuments are doing more than marking time or honoring the dead. They're teaching patience. They're slowing you down. The world feels less rushed here, less sharp around the edges. You breathe in damp air and let your shoulders drop. Whatever their original purpose, the stones still stand, still doing their quiet work, still humming faintly beneath your thoughts. You turn away from the circle and continue on, unaware that metal, myth, and more complicated power structures are already waiting just beyond the horizon, ready to reshape everything again. You feel the change before you fully understand it. The tools in people's hands look different now, warmer in color, heavier, catching the light in a way stone never did. This is the Bronze Age easing itself into Ireland, around 2500 BCE, and it doesn't arrive with drama so much as quiet confidence. Copper and tin meet, and suddenly the island has blades that last longer, weapons that hit harder, and ornaments that exist purely to say, "Yes, I'm important." You walk past a small settlement and notice how work sounds different. There's the sharper ring of metal being shaped, the rhythmic tapping that replaces the dull thud of stone tools. Farming becomes more efficient, and with that efficiency comes time. Time to specialize, to compete, to compare. This is one of the widely recognized developments of the era. Society begins to layer itself more clearly. Not everyone does the same work anymore, and not everyone eats the same food. Gold appears in surprising abundance. Ireland, improbably, becomes one of Bronze Age Europe's richest sources of gold artifacts. You imagine the glow of freshly polished lunulae, those thin, crescent-shaped collars, resting against skin in firelight. A lesser-known fact is that many of these objects show almost no signs of wear, suggesting they weren't everyday jewelry at all, but ceremonial items brought out for specific moments. Historians still debate whether these were symbols of religious authority, political power, or both, because humans have always enjoyed confusing the two. You notice something else, too. More boundaries. Fields are marked. Territories are implied. The easy, wandering flexibility of earlier life starts to stiffen. With valuable resources comes the desire to protect them. And with protection comes conflict. You don't see massive wars yet, but you sense tension, like a low note held beneath everything. Spears are carried more often. Eyes linger longer on strangers. Burial practices change. You come across graves that feel more individual, more focused on single people rather than communities. Some are buried with weapons or gold. Quiet statements meant for whoever, or whatever, might be watching from the other side. It's a subtle but important shift. Identity is becoming sharper. People want to be remembered not just as part of a group, but as someone. There's a strange intimacy to this time. Villages are still small enough that everyone knows everyone else. Yet social distance is growing. You can almost feel the comparisons happening. Who has better tools? Who controls better land? Who wears more impressive gold? If social media existed, it would be unbearable. Luckily, the only audience here is your neighbors and the ancestors you believe are listening. And always, the land absorbs it all. Gold disappears into bogs. Weapons are placed in rivers. A curious and slightly haunting detail is that many valuable items are deliberately destroyed before being offered. Bent swords, broken tools. Historians still argue whether this was meant to kill the object for ritual purposes or simply to prevent its reuse. But either way, It suggests a belief system where meaning outweighs practicality. As the centuries roll on, bronze gives way slowly to iron. The transition isn't instant, and for a long while both coexist, old and new overlapping like half-remembered dreams. You feel the world tightening, preparing for something louder, faster, more aggressive. Stories are starting to grow teeth. You keep walking, calm and unhurried, unaware that language itself is about to change the shape of everything you've seen so far. Somewhere ahead, voices are forming myths instead of monuments, and they're ready to speak directly into your memory. You start to notice the voices first, not just different accents or new words, but an entirely new rhythm to how people speak, argue, and remember. This is the long, slow arrival of the Celts into Ireland, beginning somewhere around the Late Bronze Age and solidifying during the Iron Age. It isn't a single invasion you can point to on a calendar. It's more like dye spreading through water, gradual, uneven, impossible to separate cleanly from what was already there. Still, this is one of the most familiar milestones in Irish history: the emergence of a distinctly Celtic language, culture, and identity. You hear stories now, real stories, shaped with intention, tales of heroes, battles, betrayals, and supernatural encounters begin circulating, told by firelight and remembered with care. Unlike the stone builders before them, these people don't rush to write anything down. Words are alive. Spoken words matter more than carved ones. You feel it when someone pauses mid-sentence, letting silence do some of the work. Memory becomes an art form. Iron tools are everywhere, dark, sturdy, and slightly intimidating. Farming improves again, but so does warfare. You see round shields, long spears, and swords meant for close combat. Cattle become the core unit of wealth, which feels oddly relatable, like an ancient version of checking your bank balance. Except the balance can wander off if you don't watch it closely. One lesser-known fact is that many early Irish laws, later written down, measure fines and status in cows. Historians still debate how much of this system developed before writing and how much was formalized later. But the importance of cattle is unquestionable. Power structures shift. Small kingdoms, known as tuatha, form across the island. Each tuath has its own king. But king here doesn't mean luxury. You picture someone who leads, negotiates, fights, and probably settles arguments about missing livestock. Authority is personal and local. No towering capitals, no centralized empire, just a patchwork of loyalties that feels stable until it suddenly isn't. Religion becomes more fluid, more narrative-driven. The natural world is still sacred, but now it's filled with named forces, gods and spirits tied to rivers, hills, and forests. You sense that the landscape itself is speaking through these stories, given personalities and grudges. A strange detail is how often boundaries matter. Crossroads, shorelines, and thresholds are considered especially powerful. Historians still argue whether this reflects genuine religious belief or a practical way to explain fear of the unknown. But the result is the same: You tread carefully at the edges. You notice how reputation follows people. Honor matters. Insults linger. A single song or story can elevate someone or quietly ruin them. If that sounds stressful, it is. You imagine lying awake at night, replaying conversations, hoping no one turns your worst moment into a catchy verse. In a world without written records, gossip is permanent. And yet, there's warmth here. Feasts, hospitality, shared meals. The idea that a guest must be welcomed and protected is strong. Almost sacred. You feel how community binds people together, even as rivalries simmer beneath the surface. It's a delicate balance, belonging paired with constant readiness. As you move forward, you sense that these stories, these words, will outlast swords and kingdoms. They'll survive invasions, conversions, and centuries of change. For now, though, they're still fresh, still flexible, still forming themselves in the air around you. You keep walking, listening, letting the language settle into your bones as the next transformation quietly approaches. You begin to notice how carefully people choose their words now. Not cautiously, deliberately. Speech has weight here, and you can feel it pressing gently against your chest as you move through oak groves and open clearings. This is the world of the Druids, the intellectual and spiritual backbone of early Celtic Ireland. They don't wear obvious uniforms, and they don't announce themselves. But when one begins to speak, everyone else seems to lean in without realizing it. This is a well-known feature of pre-Christian Ireland. Druids function as priests, judges, historians, poets, and advisors all rolled into one impressively multitasking role. You walk alongside a gathering where disputes are being settled, not with weapons, but with words. A druid listens, eyes half closed, as if tuning into something beneath the conversation. Law here is remembered, not written. Judgments are spoken aloud and stored in memory, passed from teacher to student over years of training that can last decades. A lesser-known fact is that Druidic education may have taken up to 20 years. Much of it devoted to memorization alone. No notes, no shortcuts, no, "I'll just look that up later." Historians still debate how accurate later descriptions of Druid training are, since most of what we know comes from much later Christian writers. But the emphasis on memory is unmistakable. The sacredness of language becomes impossible to ignore. Poetry isn't decoration, it's power. A well-crafted verse can elevate a king or shame him into irrelevance. Satire, in particular, is feared. You hear quiet jokes about how a bad poem could ruin your reputation faster than losing a battle. It's funny in a modern way, like being cancelled by a spoken word performance. Except there's no algorithm, just everyone remembering it forever. Nature feels intensely alive here. Certain trees, especially oaks, are treated with reverence. Springs and rivers are approached with offerings and caution. You watch someone drop a small object into flowing water. Not dramatically, just respectfully. A strange and fascinating detail is that many offerings are intentionally ordinary: pins, small tools, bits of food, suggesting devotion isn't about wealth but presence. Historians still argue whether these practices were primarily religious or social rituals meant to reinforce community bonds. But the line between the two is very thin. Time itself feels different. Festivals mark the year. Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, Lunasa, each one a hinge between seasons. You sense the importance of transitions, of moments when the world feels slightly less solid. Samhain, in particular, carries a hush. This is when boundaries soften, when the dead feel closer. You imagine standing near a fire as night deepens, feeling watched in a way that's not exactly frightening, just attentive. There's an undercurrent of control here. 2. Knowledge is powerful, and not everyone has access to it. Druids hold enormous influence over kings and communities, able to bless or curse, approve or condemn. You can't help but notice how comfortable they are with ambiguity, how rarely they give straight answers. If you're hoping for clarity, you might be waiting a while. As you move on, the forest begins to thin, and you feel a subtle tension building. This oral world, so dependent on memory and ritual, is about to encounter something that will challenge it deeply. Writing, scripture, a belief system that insists on putting sacred words down where anyone can see them. You keep walking, calm and receptive, as distant footsteps approach, carrying bells, books, and a very different idea of truth. You hear the animals before you see them. Lowing cattle, restless and numerous, shifting in their enclosures as dawn spreads a thin grey light across the land. In this Ireland, wealth breathes, eats, and occasionally escapes if no one's watching closely enough. This is the age of warriors and cattle raids, a period firmly embedded in early Irish tradition and later remembered in epics like the Toin Bo Qualingay. Cattle raiding isn't random chaos, it's structured, ritualized, and socially meaningful. Think less, lawless bandits. More, highly competitive agricultural accounting. You walk alongside a small war band as they prepare to move. There's no heavy armor clanking here. Just leather, shields, and spears balanced with practiced ease. These warriors aren't soldiers in a modern sense. They're farmers who fight, fighters who farm, and young men eager to prove themselves. One widely accepted reality is that warfare in early Ireland tends to be small-scale and seasonal, often avoiding mass casualties. A lesser-known detail is that many raids are timed carefully to avoid disrupting planting or harvest. Because even warriors still have to eat later, historians still debate how often these raids turned deadly, versus how often they were more about prestige and negotiation than slaughter. Honor hangs in the air like humidity. Reputation is everything. You sense it in the way people glance at one another, silently calculating status. A successful raid boosts your standing. Failure sticks to you like mud. Poets, once again, loom in the background, ready to immortalize success or quietly sharpen their satire. It's almost comforting to know that even here, public image management is exhausting. You come across a training ground where young fighters test their strength. There's shouting, laughter, The dull thump of bodies hitting earth. Fosterage is common. Children raised in other households to strengthen alliances, so loyalty spreads across families and regions in complex ways. One odd and fascinating fact is that foster bonds are often considered stronger than blood ties, sometimes creating lifelong obligations that outweigh biological family. Historians still argue about how this system affected long-term political stability, but it certainly made relationships wonderfully complicated. Law is never far away. Despite the violence you witness, there are rules. Compensation matters. Injury has a price. Death has a price too, calculated carefully based on status. You imagine the mental math involved after a skirmish. Everyone quietly wondering how many cows this situation is about to cost them. It's not exactly peaceful, but it's controlled. A society trying to balance aggression with survival. As night falls, fires are lit and stories shared. The day's tension loosens, replaced by food, drink, and boasts that grow slightly larger with each retelling. You listen, half amused, half drowsy, as warriors reenact moments with exaggerated gestures. Even here, after all the bravado, there's a sense of restraint. Total destruction would benefit no one. You settle into the rhythm of it, the cycles of raid and rest, honor and repair. It feels stable, in its own sharp-edged way. But you sense something fragile beneath the surface. A culture built on memory, reputation, and balance is about to encounter forces that don't care about local rules or seasonal timing. You keep walking, unhurried, as myths begin to solidify into something heavier, something that will soon be remembered not just in stories, but in writing. You start to feel the stories thickening around you, like fog that's learned how to speak. This is the moment when myth and memory stop pretending they're separate things. Heroes are no longer just impressive warriors you passed on a road somewhere. They're becoming larger than life. Their actions stretched and polished by repetition. This is a familiar turning point in Irish history. The age when oral tradition crystallizes into epic cycles. Especially what will later be called the Ulster cycle and the mythological cycle. You listen as a storyteller begins. Voice low and steady. The names feel heavy when spoken. Cuchulainn, Medibi, Lu. These aren't distant gods in the sky. They're painfully human. Prone to pride, rage, loyalty, and spectacularly bad decisions. One well-known element is how these heroes often have strict gisa, personal taboos or rules they must obey. Break one, and everything unravels. A lesser-known detail is how contradictory some of these taboos can be. Almost designed to trap the hero eventually. Historians still debate whether these stories reflect ancient legal concepts, moral instruction, or simply a cultural fascination with doomed greatness. You notice how violence in these tales is exaggerated, almost operatic. Single warriors hold off entire armies. Feats of strength border on the absurd. Yet beneath the spectacle, there's anxiety. These stories warn as much as they celebrate. Being exceptional is dangerous. Standing out invites attention, and attention invites downfall. It's a lesson delivered with flair, but a lesson nonetheless. The supernatural slips in effortlessly. Shape-shifting, prophetic dreams, gods walking among humans. It all feels normal here. No one pauses to explain it. And neither do you. A curious fact is that many of these myths are later written down by Christian monks, who preserve them while quietly reframing them as heroic legends rather than active religion. Historians still argue about how much was altered in the process, and how much of what you're hearing now is already shaped by later hands, smoothing rough edges to make the stories safer. You sense that these myths serve a practical purpose. They define values, bravery, loyalty, generosity, while also illustrating their limits. Kings listen carefully, aware that their own reputations might someday be filtered through similar stories. The past is becoming a tool, not just a memory. As the fire dies down, you realize how powerful this system is. Without books, without records, a culture has built a shared universe, complete with recurring characters and moral logic. It's oddly comforting, like falling asleep to a familiar show you've seen 100 times. You drift onward, stories echoing softly in your head. Ahead, something is watching Ireland from across the sea, an empire that won't arrive in full force, but whose shadow will still stretch uncomfortably close. You keep walking, letting the myths fade just enough to make room for history's next quiet pressure. You feel the presence before you ever see a single soldier. It's not footsteps on Irish soil, not burning towns or marching columns. It's pressure, distant, organized, and faintly disapproving. This is Rome, watching Ireland from across the sea. One of the most commonly taught facts about Irish history is that the Romans never fully invaded or occupied Ireland. No legions, no paved roads stamped with imperial certainty. And yet, as you walk through this time, you can sense Rome anyway, like a neighbor who never visits but still somehow influences how you arrange your furniture. Across the water, Britain is being transformed. Forts rise, roads cut clean lines through land that once looked a lot like this. You imagine traders arriving on Irish shores with unfamiliar goods, Roman coins, glass, wine containers, objects that feel strangely polished, strangely confident. A lesser-known detail is that Roman artifacts have been found scattered across Ireland, often far from the coast, suggesting trade networks and indirect contact that ran deeper than we once assumed. Historians still debate whether some Irish leaders actively sought Roman alliances or simply benefited from proximity without commitment. You meet a local king who understands this balance perfectly. He wants Roman goods, Roman prestige, but not Roman rule. He wears imported ornaments, drinks from foreign cups, and tells stories that quietly emphasize how Ireland remains unconquered. It's a clever performance, borrowing the shine without accepting the leash. If Rome represents bureaucracy, Ireland responds with flexibility and selective hearing. There's a strange calm in this era. No dramatic collapse, no sudden conversion, just influence seeping in at the edges. Military tactics evolve slightly, Wealth concentrates in certain hands. Power becomes more performative. You notice larger Hilfords, more elaborate feasting halls. Status is being displayed more intentionally now, as if everyone senses that the world beyond Ireland is becoming louder, more centralized, more intrusive. One odd and fascinating fact is that some classical Roman writers mention Ireland, Hibernia, but only vaguely. Often incorrectly, they describe it as cold, distant, and somewhat mysterious, which feels unfair given the weather is already doing enough damage to its reputation. Historians still argue about how much reliable information Romans actually had, versus how much they were just guessing from across the sea, filling blanks with stereotypes. Spiritually, nothing breaks. The gods are still here. The stories still circulate. Druids still speak with authority. But there's a subtle shift in awareness. Ireland is no longer the entire world. It's a world adjacent to something massive and organized. Something that writes things down and expects obedience. You can almost feel the cultural immune system strengthening in response. Tradition held a little tighter. Stories repeated with extra care. As you move forward, Rome begins to fade. Not because it stops mattering, but because it starts to crumble elsewhere. The empire weakens, fractures, and eventually withdraws from Britain. Ireland watches, absorbs the lesson, and remains itself. But that vacuum, left behind by Rome's retreat, creates space. Space for new ideas, new beliefs, and new figures to step quietly onto the stage. You keep walking, unhurried, as distant bells and unfamiliar prayers begin to drift faintly on the air, signaling that Ireland's next transformation will arrive not with swords, but with words. You notice the sound first. Not shouting, not battle cries, just a bell, soft and uncertain, carried on the damp air. It doesn't demand attention, it waits for it. This is how Christianity enters Ireland, and that detail alone already sets it apart from much of Europe. One of the most widely recognized moments in Irish history is the arrival of St. Patrick in the 5th century. Though even now the edges of his story blur a little when you stare at them too long. You walk the same narrow paths he might have walked, feeling how the land doesn't resist him so much as observe him. Patrick doesn't arrive with armies or imperial backing. He arrives with stories, symbols, and an unsettling confidence that this message will eventually stick. A lesser-known fact is that Patrick was likely not the first Christian to reach Ireland. Small Christian communities may already have existed through trade and contact with Roman Britain. Historians still debate how much credit Patrick deserves versus how much he represents a broader, slower conversion already underway. You sense the tension immediately. This new belief talks about one God, one truth, one written authority. That doesn't fit neatly into a world of many gods, spoken law, and flexible boundaries. And yet, it doesn't shatter the old system either. Instead, it slides into it. Patrick speaks to kings, not crowds. He understands power flows from the top down here. Convert a ruler, and the people will at least listen. You watch a symbolic moment. fires lit on a hill in defiance of a pagan festival. A dramatic gesture meant to say, "This belief is not afraid of yours. It's bold, maybe reckless, and it works." The old religion doesn't vanish, but it bends. Sacred wells become holy wells. Festivals shift dates and names. A strange and fascinating detail is how many Irish saints seem to inherit traits of older deities. As if the gods simply changed uniforms. Historians still argue whether this was intentional syncretism or a natural cultural adaptation. But either way, it made the transition smoother. Writing begins to matter now. Latin letters appear, at first awkwardly, like a foreign accent on the page. You feel the weight of it immediately. Words that once lived only in memory can now be fixed, preserved, argued over. For Druids, this is a threat. For monks, it's a revelation. You stand between these worlds, feeling the balance tip just slightly. There's humor here, too, if you listen for it. Imagine explaining the Trinity to someone who already believes rivers have personalities. Surprisingly, that part goes fine. The debates are intense but oddly polite, like philosophical arguments stretched over generations. No mass burnings, no forced baptisms on a grand scale. Just persuasion, negotiation, and time. As you move on, you realize something important. Ireland is changing. But it's not erasing itself. The stories don't stop. They're just being retold with new meanings layered on top. You keep walking, bells fading behind you, as quiet stone buildings begin to appear in the distance, places of ink, silence, and a kind of learning that will soon make this small island famous far beyond its shores. You step into the hush before you fully understand it. The world hasn't gone silent. There are birds, wind, distant water, but human noise has been carefully turned down, like someone lowering the volume out of respect. This is the monastery, and it feels different from anything you've encountered so far. One of the most widely accepted developments of early medieval Ireland is the rapid spread of monastic communities after conversion. Not clustered in cities, but scattered across coasts, islands, and lonely inland spaces. You walk toward low stone buildings that seem to lean into the landscape rather than dominate it. Inside, the air smells faintly of smoke, vellum, and damp wool. Monks move slowly, deliberately, as if speed itself might be a distraction. Prayer structures the day, but so does work. You watch someone scraping a calfskin clean, preparing it to become a page. Writing here is labor, physical, careful, and time-consuming. A lesser-known fact is that producing a single manuscript could take months or even years, depending on size and decoration. Historians still debate how these communities balanced intense spiritual routines with the sheer workload of book production. But somehow, they did both. You sit near a scribe, listening to the scratch of a quill. Latin flows onto the page, elegant and precise, but something interesting is happening in the margins. Small notes appear in Irish, tucked between lines or scribbled beside the text. This is one of Ireland's quiet contributions to European culture, bilingual scholarship. Monks aren't just copying foreign texts, they're thinking alongside them. A strange and wonderful detail is that some of the earliest written Irish language survives precisely because it was jotted down by monks explaining Latin grammar to themselves. Historians still argue whether this was an act of preservation or simply convenience. But the result is the same. Irish thought sneaks into the written record. Outside the monastery walls, the world remains turbulent. Kingdoms rise and fall. Cattle are still counted. Old laws still govern daily life. But inside, time stretches. You feel it in the repetition of prayers. The cycle of seasons marked by feasts rather than raids. Knowledge accumulates quietly here, layer by layer, while much of Europe is fragmenting after Rome's collapse. There's a humility to these places that's easy to miss. The monks don't see themselves as saviors of civilization. They're just doing what they believe is necessary, copying texts, teaching students, offering hospitality to travelers who arrive cold, wet, and grateful. One odd fact is that many monasteries function as informal schools, hospitals, and guest houses all at once. Historians still debate how intentionally organized this system was, versus how much it grew organically out of need and tradition. As night falls, you feel a deep calm settle over you. The steady rhythm of prayer and work has a lulling effect, like waves repeating the same gentle motion. You realize that while armies and kings will come and go, these quiet rooms of ink and silence are anchoring something fragile but powerful. You step back out into the cool air, carrying that calm with you. Beyond the monastery, the wider world is stirring again. Trade routes reopening, sails appearing on the horizon, bringing not just books and ideas, but strangers with very sharp axes and very little interest in silence. You keep walking, unhurried, as the sound of the sea grows louder ahead. You feel it almost immediately, the sense that this small island is punching far above its weight. The monasteries you passed earlier are no longer just quiet refuges, they're humming, connected by paths of learning that stretch far beyond the coastline. This is what historians later call Ireland's golden age of learning, roughly from the 6th to the 8th centuries. And it's one of those moments that sounds exaggerated until you sit inside it and realize it's quietly, undeniably real. You imagine scholars arriving from Britain and the continent, drawn by Ireland's reputation for study and spiritual discipline. Europe beyond the sea is unstable, former Roman cities shrinking, political authority splintering, but here, learning feels oddly safe. A well-established historical fact is that Irish monks preserve and copy not only Christian texts but also works of classical learning that might otherwise have vanished. You picture shelves holding writings by authors whose names will one day sound intimidating in philosophy classes, all resting calmly in rooms that smell faintly of peat smoke. A lesser-known detail is how mobile Irish scholarship becomes. Monks don't just stay put, they travel. Figures like Columbanus and Columba establish monasteries abroad, carrying Irish learning into places that have almost forgotten how to read Latin properly. You can almost feel the quiet pride in this. No empire, no army, just books and stubborn discipline. Historians still debate whether Ireland truly saved European learning or simply contributed significantly to its survival. But there's no doubt this island becomes an intellectual crossroads. Art flourishes alongside study. You see illuminated manuscripts growing more elaborate, interlaced patterns, spirals, animals woven into letters until text and image are inseparable. The Book of Kells will later become the most famous example, but right now it's just part of a wider tradition of visual obsession. A strange fact is that some of these designs are so intricate they're barely visible to the naked eye, suggesting they were made not for display, but devotion. Historians still argue whether this level of detail was meant for God, the artist's discipline, or both. Life isn't perfect. Monasteries can be targets. Power still attracts jealousy. Some abbots wield influence that rivals kings, blurring the line between spiritual and political authority. You sense tension there, a reminder that even holy spaces aren't immune to ambition. Still, the dominant mood is confidence. Ireland knows what it's good at, and it's leaning into it. As you walk on, the air feels lighter, almost hopeful. Bells ring in the distance, not as warnings but as invitations. Yet even here, the horizon isn't empty. Ships are coming again. This time not traders or pilgrims, but raiders who see these peaceful centers of wealth and learning as opportunities. You keep moving forward, calm and unafraid, as the first longships begin to cut silently through the gray water toward shore. You hear the sea change before anyone says a word. It's not louder, exactly, just sharper, more purposeful. The waves feel watched now. This is the arrival of the Vikings, beginning at the end of the 8th century, and it breaks the rhythm you've settled into. One of the most familiar events in Irish history is the raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793. But Ireland feels the impact almost immediately after. The first Viking raids here are sudden, fast, and terrifyingly efficient. You stand near a coastal monastery as black shapes slide out of the mist. Longships beach quickly. Men spill out, armed, shouting in a language that cuts through the air. They move with intent. Gold, silver, books, anything valuable or portable. This is a widely accepted historical reality. Early Viking activity in Ireland is focused on raiding, especially monasteries, which are wealthy, lightly defended, and conveniently isolated. A lesser-known detail is that some raids may have been opportunistic rather than planned, following rumors carried along trade routes. Historians still debate whether these early attacks were coordinated campaigns or simply a series of brutal experiments that proved how vulnerable these places were. The shock runs deep. Monasteries that once felt timeless now feel exposed. You imagine monks scrambling, hiding manuscripts, praying under their breath as buildings burn. It's easy to paint this as pure destruction, and there is plenty of that, but you also sense something more complex beginning to form. These raiders aren't ghosts. They return. Again and again, and with repetition comes familiarity. Over time, the Vikings change. Or maybe Ireland changes them. Raids turn into overwintering camps. Camps turn into settlements. This transition, from raiders to residents, is one of the most important developments of the era. A strange and often overlooked fact is that many of Ireland's first true towns, Dublin, Waterford, Limerick, begin as Viking bases. Historians still argue about how quickly these places became integrated into Irish society. But the archaeological evidence shows trade flourishing alongside conflict. You walk through one of these early towns. It smells of fish, smoke, leather, and salt. Markets buzz. Coins circulate. Slavery exists here, uncomfortable and real, with people bought and sold as part of wider Viking trade networks. It's not a pleasant detail, but it's an honest one. Still, life is happening. People marry across cultures. Languages blend. Children grow up bilingual without thinking twice about it. The violence doesn't vanish. Battles flare between Irish kings and Viking leaders. Alliances form and dissolve, sometimes within the same year. Yet there's a strange pragmatism at work. Enemies one season become trading partners the next. Survival encourages flexibility. Historians still debate whether the Vikings ultimately weakened Ireland or reshaped it into something more outward-looking. But either way, the island is no longer isolated. As you move on, the fear sharpens into alertness, then into adaptation. Ireland is learning, once again, how to absorb an intrusion without losing itself entirely. You keep walking, the sound of hammers and shipyards behind you, as power structures begin to shift yet again, this time toward kings who understand both swords and silver. You don't flinch as much anymore when you hear foreign voices. That's the first sign things have changed. The Vikings are no longer just shadows slipping back into the sea. They're neighbors now. Competitors. Sometimes allies. This is the phase historians often describe as the transition from Viking raids to Viking towns. And it reshapes Ireland in ways that are easy to overlook because they don't look dramatic at first glance. You walk through what will one day be Dublin, though right now it's still a rough-edged settlement hugging the river. Timber buildings cluster together. Smoke curls upward. People argue over prices in a mix of languages that somehow works anyway. One well-known historical development is that the Vikings introduce urban life to Ireland in a sustained way. Permanent towns with markets, docks, and trade networks stretching across the Irish Sea and beyond. A lesser-known detail is that many Irish kings quickly recognized the usefulness of these towns, protecting them in exchange for taxes and access to wealth. Historians still debate whether these towns represent foreign impositions or joint creations shaped just as much by Irish needs as Viking ambition. You notice how money changes behavior. Silver coins pass from hand to hand, and suddenly value is something you can weigh instead of count in cattle. Trade brings variety, fine cloth, wine, weapons, and ideas. Power starts to concentrate around ports and rivers rather than just fertile land. This doesn't replace older systems overnight, but it complicates them. Kings now have to think about tolls, ships, and alliances that extend far beyond their tuath. Culturally, the blending is subtle but persistent. Norse gods don't replace Irish ones, but names cross borders, marriages link families, children grow up knowing more than one story about how the world works. And that flexibility becomes normal. A curious fact is that many Viking leaders in Ireland eventually convert to Christianity. Sometimes sincerely, sometimes strategically. Historians still argue about how deep these conversions ran, but baptism becomes a political tool as much as a spiritual one. Violence hasn't disappeared, it's just more organized. Battles now involve larger forces, fortified towns, and clearer stakes. You sense ambition sharpening. Whoever controls these towns controls trade, wealth, and influence. The old balance between kings is tipping, slowly but unmistakably. As you leave the bustle behind, you feel the island tightening again, preparing for confrontation on a larger scale. The era of small, local struggles is fading. Ahead lies a moment when power will collide openly, when alliances will shatter, and when one battle will echo far longer than anyone expects. You keep walking, steady and unhurried, as the sound of gathering armies begins to murmur in the distance. You feel the weight of expectation in the air, like a storm that everyone knows is coming but no one can quite stop. Power has been pooling for a while now, around towns, around trade routes, around kings who understand that silver can be as sharp as steel. This is the age of high kingship and rivalry, when Ireland's patchwork of Tuatha begins to strain under the idea that one ruler might stand above the rest. It's a familiar historical theme, the rise and contest of high kings, with Tara looming large as a symbol if not always a reality. You walk toward Tara, not as a glittering capital, but as a place heavy with meaning. Earthworks roll gently underfoot, and the wind carries voices that sound like arguments carried on for centuries. A widely accepted fact is that Tara functions more as a ceremonial and ideological center than a true seat of centralized power. Kings come here to be seen, acknowledged, and woven into a story larger than their own lands. A lesser-known detail is that many high kings likely held the title in name more than in absolute control. Relying on alliances, hostages, and careful intimidation, historians still debate how real high kingship ever was, versus how much it was a shared myth everyone agreed to play along with. Rivalries sharpen. You watch messengers moving quickly between courts, carrying promises, threats, and gifts wrapped in politeness. One king grows powerful, another grows nervous. Vikings are part of this equation now, sometimes enemies, sometimes hired muscle, sometimes convenient scapegoats when things go wrong. Loyalty feels temporary, like a bridge made of rope and optimism. You sense how exhausting leadership must be. A king isn't just ruling, he's constantly performing, hosting feasts, rewarding followers, punishing rivals just enough to be feared but not enough to provoke rebellion. Even a small misstep, an insult unaddressed, a gift withheld, can unravel years of careful balance. If this all sounds like office politics with spears, that's because it is. Battles flare, then fade. No single clash settles everything, but each one leaves a mark. You notice how stories travel faster than facts. A victory becomes legendary by the time it reaches the next valley. A defeat is softened, reframed, or blamed on someone conveniently absent. Historians still argue about the accuracy of these accounts, because so much of what survives is shaped by whoever won the argument afterward. As night falls, you feel a tightening in the narrative. All these rivalries, all this maneuvering, are drawing lines toward a confrontation that will briefly promise clarity. One battle, one decisive moment. At least that's how it will be remembered. You keep walking, calm and receptive, as the murmur of armies grows louder and the name of a place, Clontarf, begins to form. Not yet a legend, but no longer just a location either. You arrive at the battlefield after the noise has already started to settle. That's how history often feels. Less like standing in the middle of chaos. More like stepping into the heavy quiet just after. This is Clontarf, in 1014, and it has become one of the most famous moments in Irish history. The battle where Brian Boru faces a coalition of Viking forces and Irish rivals. It's often remembered as the battle that ended the Vikings in Ireland. Though even standing here, you can tell that version is a little too tidy. You walk across uneven ground near the coast. The air thick with salt and exhaustion. Bodies lie where they fell. Shields are cracked. The tide is moving in and out. Indifferent, already beginning its slow work of erasing footprints. One widely accepted fact is that Brian Boru's forces ultimately win the battle, breaking the power of key Viking leaders. A lesser-known detail is that Brian himself is killed afterward, reportedly in his tent, far from the main fighting. Historians still debate exactly how and when he died, because the sources don't quite agree, and because legends prefer a cleaner ending than reality usually provides. As you listen to survivors talk, the story starts to fracture. Some describe heroic charges, others remember confusion, shifting alliances, and moments when no one was quite sure who was fighting for whom. That's the uncomfortable truth beneath the legend. Clontarf is not a simple clash of Irish versus Viking. Irish kings fight on both sides. Vikings fight alongside Irish allies. It's less a final showdown and more a violent knot of regional politics finally pulled too tight. Still, symbols matter. Brian Boru becomes something larger than himself, a stand-in for unity, resistance, and the possibility that Ireland might briefly act as one. You can feel how desperately people want that to be true. A single narrative is comforting, especially after so much blood. Historians still argue about whether Brian ever truly ruled as a high king over all Ireland, or whether his authority was impressive but limited. Either way, his reputation outgrows the reality, and that reputation will last. The aftermath is quieter but no less important. Viking towns don't disappear. Dublin continues to thrive. Trade continues. Intermarriage continues. What changes is balance. The era of Vikings as dominant raiders fades, replaced by a more integrated, urban presence. The fear sharpens into familiarity. The outsider becomes part of the landscape. You notice how memory begins its work almost immediately. Songs form, stories simplify, complex alliances flatten into moral lessons. It's not dishonest, it's human. People need meaning, especially after loss. You feel that pull yourself. The desire to let this moment feel final, resolved, neatly wrapped. But history doesn't rest. As you move on from Clontarf, the land feels unsettled, as if the old rhythms are gone but nothing solid has replaced them yet. Kings are still competing. Power is still local, and beyond the sea. New figures are already watching Ireland with interest. Men who build in stone, speak French, and believe very strongly in paperwork. You keep walking, letting the legend of Clontarf fade gently behind you, as the sound of hammers on stone begins to echo faintly ahead. You hear the sound of stone before you see it. Not the old stones, those patient circles and earthworks, but sharp, purposeful construction, stones stacked to last, to dominate, to remind everyone nearby who is in charge. This is the arrival of the Normans in Ireland, beginning in 1169, and it feels different immediately. One of the most well-known turning points in Irish history is the Norman landing. Invited, somewhat desperately, by an Irish king seeking help to reclaim his throne. And as you stand here, you can already sense how invitations like this tend to get out of hand. You walk along the coast where armored figures disembark. Their gear looks heavy, disciplined, expensive. These aren't seasonal raiders or loosely allied warbands. These are professionals. They build quickly, efficiently, and with unsettling confidence. A widely accepted fact is that the Normans introduced new military technology to Ireland: stone castles, heavy cavalry, and tightly organized forces. A lesser-known detail is how adaptable they are, adopting local customs and even language faster than anyone expects. Historians still debate whether the Normans intended full conquest from the beginning or simply expanded opportunistically once they realized how fractured Irish power remained. Castles rise across the landscape like punctuation marks. You walk beneath one, feeling its shadow stretch over land that once relied on memory and reputation for control. Now authority is vertical, visible, and very difficult to ignore. These fortresses aren't just military structures, they're statements. They say, "This place is claimed, recorded, defended." Paperwork follows close behind: charters, grants, titles, turning land into something that can be measured, owned, and inherited with unnerving precision. You notice how quickly alliances shift. Some Irish kings resist fiercely, others cooperate, marry into Norman families, or use Norman strength to settle old scores. The lines blur almost immediately. A strange and often overlooked fact is that within a few generations, many Norman families become more Irish than the Irish themselves, blending into local culture while still benefiting from their initial advantage. Historians still argue about whether this cultural blending weakened English control or simply changed its shape. Life on the ground becomes more complicated. Old laws coexist uneasily with new ones. Towns grow under Norman protection. Trade increases, but so does displacement. You see communities pushed aside, boundaries redrawn, forests cleared to feed growing populations. Progress and loss arrive together, inseparable. As you move forward, you sense the long shadow this moment will cast. What begins as a request for help becomes centuries of entanglement. Control will tighten, loosen, and tighten again. Resistance will flare, adapt, and endure. The land remembers all of it. You keep walking, calm and steady, as castles multiply behind you and the future of Ireland settles into a tense, unfinished balance, one that will echo far longer than anyone standing here can imagine. You feel the tension settle into your shoulders before you can name it. The castles are still there behind you, solid and unmoving, but the world beneath them refuses to stay neatly ordered. This is the age of Gaelic resilience, when Irish culture bends without breaking, adapting itself around foreign structures that were supposed to replace it. One of the most widely accepted realities of this period is that Norman control never fully swallows Ireland. Instead, it thins, frays, and reshapes itself, especially beyond the fortified towns and fertile lowlands. You walk through regions where Norman influence fades the farther you go. Here, Irish laws, Brian laws, still govern daily life. Kinship still matters more than charters. Poets still carry social power that feels oddly disproportionate if you're used to paperwork deciding everything. A lesser-known detail is that many Norman lords themselves begin to rely on Irish legal customs when it suits them, especially in areas where enforcing English-style law proves impractical. Historians still debate whether this represents resistance, pragmatism, or simply the gravitational pull of a deeply rooted culture that refuses to be erased. Language tells the story before architecture does. You hear Irish spoken confidently, even proudly, in places that are technically under Norman rule. Names soften, accents blend, identities blur. Some Norman families adopt Irish dress, Irish names, and Irish alliances. The phrase later used to describe this, more Irish than the Irish themselves, isn't just poetic exaggeration. It reflects genuine anxiety from English authorities watching control slip through cultural assimilation rather than open rebellion. You sense how the balance of power shifts subtly. Kingship here isn't gone, it's transformed. Local lords regain influence in areas the Normans can't easily project force into. Warfare returns to smaller scales, raids, skirmishes, shifting loyalties, familiar rhythms resurfacing beneath the stone-heavy presence of castles. It's like an old song playing quietly under a new one, refusing to be drowned out. There's a quiet confidence in this survival. No grand declarations. No unified uprising, just persistence. Laws remembered, stories retold, land worked according to inherited custom. A strange and telling fact is that many Norman-built castles eventually fall into disuse not because they're destroyed, but because maintaining them proves unnecessary or inconvenient in regions where cooperation matters more than domination. Historians still argue about how inevitable this cultural resurgence was, but standing here, it feels less like a comeback and more like gravity reasserting itself. As you move forward, though, you feel that this balance is fragile. Beyond Ireland, England is changing. Its rulers are becoming more centralized, more bureaucratic, more impatient with ambiguity. The tolerance that allowed cultures to blur will not last forever. Pressure is building again, slow and deliberate, like someone tightening a grip one finger at a time. You keep walking, steady and unhurried, as the air grows heavier with authority yet to come, authority that will speak in the language of crowns, reform, and control. And that will soon demand far more than quiet adaptation. You feel the atmosphere tighten, as if the air itself has learned a new word: control. This is the Tudor era pressing down on Ireland, beginning in earnest in the 16th century, and it feels nothing like the loose, negotiable power you've known before. One of the most widely recognized shifts in Irish history is the Tudor monarchy's determination to bring Ireland fully under English authority, not just in name, but in law, language, and loyalty. You sense immediately that flexibility is no longer a virtue here. Ambiguity is being hunted. You walk through lands where English officials now travel with documents instead of poets, seals instead of stories. The crown wants consistency. Taxes collected the same way everywhere. Laws enforced the same way everywhere. Loyalty defined clearly, publicly, and permanently. A lesser-known detail is that many Irish lords initially cooperate, seeing Tudor reforms as a way to secure their own positions. Surrender and regret. Giving up land to the crown only to receive it back under English law. Sounds reasonable on paper. Historians still debate whether these agreements were ever meant to be fair or whether they were designed from the start to erode traditional Irish authority. Religion sharpens everything. The English crown breaks with Rome, and suddenly loyalty isn't just political, it's spiritual. You feel how destabilizing this is. Ireland has woven Christianity into its culture for centuries, but now the version being imposed feels foreign, mandatory, and suspiciously tied to obedience. A strange and unsettling fact is that religious conformity becomes a test of political reliability. Even when most people barely understand the theological arguments involved, historians still argue about how deeply religious belief versus political survival motivated resistance during this period. But the consequences are the same either way. You see rebellions flare, localized, passionate, ultimately crushed. The Desmond rebellions devastate Munster. Land is confiscated, redistributed, replanned, villages empty, fields go wild. The land itself seems exhausted. English administrators view this as order being restored. The people living here experience it as dislocation layered on top of grief. And yet, even here, adaptation tries to survive. Irish culture doesn't disappear, but it retreats into language, into memory, into quieter spaces. You notice how people speak more carefully, how loyalty becomes something you perform differently depending on who's listening. If this all feels mentally tiring, that's because it is. Living under surveillance always is. As you move on, you realize something crucial has changed. Power no longer negotiates, it dictates, and it's preparing to reshape not just who rules Ireland, but who lives where, on what land, and under what conditions. You keep walking, unhurried but alert, as the ground beneath you begins to shift again, this time marked not by castles or kings, but by plantations, borders, and the slow, deliberate erasure of old certainties. You notice the divide before anyone explains it to you. It's there in how people greet one another, or don't, in which doors are open, and which stay firmly shut. This is the age of faith and division, when religion hardens into identity and identity hardens into something dangerously permanent. One of the most widely recognized facts of this period is that Ireland becomes overwhelmingly Catholic while English rule defines itself as Protestant, turning belief into a political fault line that cuts through every layer of life. You walk through towns where churches have changed hands, sometimes more than once. The buildings look the same, but the prayers sound different, and that difference matters more than it probably should. A lesser-known detail is that, for many ordinary people, the theological distinctions are vague at best. What matters is which side you're seen standing on. Historians still debate how much of the conflict here is driven by genuine religious conviction versus how much is fueled by land ownership, power, and fear dressed up as faith. You feel how suspicion becomes routine. Attendance is watched. Words are chosen carefully. A casual comment can mark you as loyal or dangerous depending on who hears it. Catholicism survives largely underground, practiced quietly, often outdoors, with makeshift altars and trusted lookouts. There's a strange intimacy to it. Faith stripped of comfort, reduced to shared risk. At the same time, Protestant settlers view their position as precarious too, surrounded by a population that does not see them as belonging. Fear flows both ways, feeding itself. The law begins to reflect this tension. Oaths matter. Allegiances are tested. You sense how exhausting it is to live in a world where belief is no longer personal, but administrative. A strange and telling fact is that even converts are rarely trusted fully. Once suspicion exists, it tends to linger. Historians still argue about whether a different approach to religious difference could ever have worked here, or whether the combination of conquest and reform made conflict inevitable. Violence flickers at the edges, sometimes open, sometimes restrained, but always present. You hear rumors of uprisings, of plots both real and imagined. Communities pull inward, identity narrows. The land itself seems to reflect this, parceled more aggressively, measured and remeasured as if ownership alone might settle the question of belonging. As you move forward, you realize that this division is becoming self-sustaining. Children inherit it without fully understanding it. Stories harden into assumptions. What began as reform has turned into a long memory of grievance and defense. You keep walking, steady and quiet, as the ground ahead prepares for a transformation that will lock these divisions into geography itself, through planned settlements, enforced displacement, and a name that will echo for centuries: the plantations. You feel the change in the land before anyone names it. Paths are straighter now. Fields feel measured rather than inherited. Boundaries that once lived in memory have been hammered into the ground. This is the era of the plantations, most decisively in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, and it marks one of the most disruptive transformations Ireland has ever experienced. One widely recognized historical fact is that vast areas of land, especially in Ulster, are confiscated from Irish landholders and granted to settlers from England and Scotland, reshaping not just ownership, but daily life itself. You walk through territory that has been carefully redesigned. New towns are laid out with intention. Fortified houses appear where farmsteads once stood. Settlers arrive with different farming methods, different laws, different expectations of permanence. A lesser-known detail is that many plantation plans look orderly on paper but struggle in reality. Poor soil, resistance, and unfamiliar conditions undermine the neat vision. Historians still debate whether the plantations were primarily economic projects, security measures, or ideological experiments in social control. But standing here, they feel like all three layered together. Displacement is not always loud. Sometimes it's administrative. A document changes hands, and suddenly a family is living on land it no longer owns. Rents replace relationships. You notice how quickly insecurity seeps in. For the dispossessed, the future becomes uncertain. For settlers, the present feels constantly threatened. Violence flickers. Burned homes, retaliations, quiet acts of sabotage, but it's the tension that lingers most. A constant low hum beneath everyday routines. Religion deepens the divide. Protestant settlers cluster together, supported by law and military presence. Catholic Irish communities are pushed outward, often into poorer land. Geography itself begins to encode belief. A strange and telling fact is that many of the divisions created during the Ulster plantations still map closely onto modern political and religious boundaries. Historians still argue about how intentional this long-term segregation was, versus how much it emerged from fear and mistrust on all sides. You sense how memory changes here. Loss becomes inherited. Stories aren't just about what happened to you, but what was taken from your grandparents, your great-grandparents. At the same time, settlers begin telling their own stories of hardship and defense, of carving stability out of hostility. Two narratives grow side by side, rarely intersecting except in conflict. As you move on, you realize something important has shifted. This isn't just conquest anymore, it's restructuring. The land itself has been rewritten, and the effects will outlast the people who planned it. You keep walking, slower now, as the weight of these changes settles into the soil, preparing the ground for rebellion, repression, and laws designed to make inequality feel permanent. You can almost feel the anger humming beneath the surface now, like heat trapped under stone. This is the era of rebellion and suppression, when the pressure built by plantations, faith, and dispossession finally finds places to burst through. One of the most widely recognized moments here is the Irish Rebellion of 1641, which begins as a coordinated uprising and quickly dissolves into something far messier and more frightening. You sense how quickly control slips once fear takes over. You walk through villages where rumors travel faster than facts. Stories of attacks grow with each retelling, sharpening into accusations that justify retaliation. Violence becomes cyclical, each act remembered, each memory used to excuse the next. A lesser-known detail is how uneven this rebellion is. Some areas erupt. Others hesitate. Some attempt negotiation. Historians still debate whether the uprising was driven more by desperation over land loss or by religious fear. But on the ground, those motivations are inseparable. The response is brutal. English and Scottish forces return with overwhelming intent, determined not just to restore order but to make resistance unthinkable. You feel the scale shift. This isn't local punishment anymore, it's systematic suppression. Confiscations multiply. Executions become public messages. Communities scatter. One strange and chilling fact is how often famine follows violence, not as a separate disaster, but as its quiet consequence. Historians still argue over the exact death tolls of this period because records are fragmented and often politically shaped. But everyone agrees the loss is enormous. Then comes Cromwell. His name carries weight even centuries later. And you feel why. His campaign in Ireland is fast, ruthless, and unapologetic. Certain towns, Drogheda, Wexford, become symbols of terror. A widely accepted fact is that these sieges leave deep psychological scars that outlast the military outcomes themselves. A lesser-known detail is that Cromwell's policies include mass deportations and forced labor, scattering Irish people across continents. Historians still debate how much of his brutality was strategic calculation versus ideological conviction. But the result is the same: devastation. Land changes hands again. Catholic ownership collapses to a fraction of what it once was. The phrase, "to hell or to Connacht," circulates, reflecting forced relocations into poorer regions. You walk through empty fields, imagining how silence replaces daily life when communities are uprooted. Memory thickens here, turning grief into something durable. As you move forward, you sense a hardening. Resistance doesn't disappear, it retreats inward. Survival becomes the priority. Open rebellion proves too costly. But resentment doesn't fade. It settles, waiting. You keep walking, slower now, as the world prepares to codify inequality into law, transforming punishment into policy and making suffering feel bureaucratically permanent. You feel the quiet tighten around you. Not peaceful this time, but constrained. This is the era of the penal laws, and it's heavy in a way that doesn't announce itself loudly. There are no marching armies now, no burning towns in front of you, Just rules. Endless, careful rules designed to make certain lives smaller. One of the most widely accepted facts about this period is that the penal laws systematically restrict the rights of Catholics in Ireland, limiting land ownership, education, political participation, and even how faith can be practiced. You walk through a village where nothing looks unusual at first glance. Fields are still worked, children still play, but beneath that surface, choices have narrowed. A Catholic landowner divides property among sons in ways that weaken the family. Because the law demands it, a parent quietly decides not to send a child to school, knowing education could invite scrutiny. A lesser-known detail is that many Protestant families quietly bend these laws when it suits them, leasing land or allowing informal schooling, creating a shadow system that exists alongside official repression. Historians still debate whether the penal laws were fully enforced everywhere or whether their greatest power came from fear of enforcement rather than constant application. You sense how exhausting this uncertainty is. Every interaction carries calculation. Who can you trust? What can you say out loud? Catholic worship continues, but often in the open air, led by priests who move constantly to avoid attention. There's an odd resilience in this. Faith practiced with minimal comfort, stripped down to essentials. At the same time, some people convert, at least on paper, to gain stability. A strange and telling fact is how often these conversions are reversible, reflecting belief shaped by survival rather than conviction. Historians still argue about how sincere or strategic these shifts were, but sincerity is hard to measure when the alternative is exclusion. Economically, inequality hardens. Land accumulates in fewer hands. Opportunity narrows along religious lines. You feel how this reshapes ambition itself. People aim lower, not because they lack ability, but because the ceiling is visibly close. And yet, culture refuses to vanish. Music, language, and storytelling persist in kitchens and fields, passed quietly, deliberately, as if secrecy itself has become a form of preservation. As time moves forward, cracks appear. The laws begin to soften, not out of generosity, but practicality. A changing world, new political pressures, and the realization that permanent suppression breeds instability all push reform into view. You feel a faint loosening, a cautious breath drawn after generations of restraint. You keep walking, steady and patient, as something long restrained begins to stir again, not rebellion yet, but awareness, identity, memory, and hope are aligning, preparing for an awakening that will speak through culture first, and politics soon after. You feel it first as a change in posture. People stand a little straighter now. They listen differently. This is the slow awakening of identity in late 18th and early 19th century Ireland. And it doesn't begin with shouting or marching. It begins with words. One of the most widely recognized developments of this period is the gradual revival of Irish cultural and political confidence, expressed through literature, music, scholarship, and eventually reform movements that dare to imagine a future beyond quiet endurance. You walk into a room where people are reading aloud, pamphlets, poems, essays. Ideas are circulating again, carefully but persistently. The penal laws are loosening. And with that loosening comes space to think. A lesser-known detail is how important educated Catholics and Presbyterians become in this moment, forming unexpected alliances based on shared exclusion rather than shared belief. Historians still debate whether this cooperation was ideological or simply strategic. But for the people involved, it feels like possibility. Language matters deeply. Irish is still spoken widely, especially in rural areas, but English becomes the language of advancement. You sense the tension in this progress paired with loss. Some see bilingualism as opportunity. Others feel something slipping away. At the same time, interest in Ireland's ancient past grows. Old myths, laws, and histories are collected, translated, and discussed with new seriousness. A strange and telling fact is that much of what modern Ireland knows about its early culture is preserved during this period by people trying to prove that Ireland has always been more than a colony. Historians still argue about how romanticized these reconstructions are, but they serve a purpose. They remind people who they are allowed to be. Politically, reform movements gain momentum. Groups like the United Irishmen imagine a republic where religious divisions dissolve into shared citizenship. It's an ambitious vision, perhaps too ambitious. The rebellion of 1798 erupts with hope and collapses into violence and repression. You feel the heartbreak in its aftermath, the realization that unity is harder than theory suggests. A lesser-known detail is how regionally uneven the rebellion is, with some areas fully mobilized and others barely involved. Historians still debate whether better coordination could have changed the outcome. But standing here, it feels like the moment arrived before the conditions could support it. And yet, the idea doesn't die. It lingers. Reform continues through quieter channels: education, advocacy, gradual political pressure. Figures emerge who understand that mass support matters. That identity must be lived as well as argued. You sense patience returning, tempered now with intention. As you move forward, you feel the ground shifting again. Awareness has been raised. Expectations have changed. People are no longer simply surviving history. They are beginning to imagine shaping it. You keep walking, calm and attentive, as population grows, land strains, and a catastrophe approaches. One that will test every belief, every reform, and every fragile hope that has begun to take root. You sense the fragility before the collapse arrives. The land feels overworked, stretched thin, asked to give more than it reasonably can. This is Ireland on the eve of the Great Famine in the 1840s. And it's a moment heavy with quiet dependence. One of the most widely recognized facts about this period is how central the potato has become to survival. Especially for the rural poor. You walk through small plots where entire families rely on a single crop. Grown with skill and care, yet terrifyingly vulnerable. When the blight arrives, it doesn't announce itself with drama. The leaves darken, the tubers rot underground, A harvest that looks promising one week is worthless the next. You feel the shock ripple outward, not just hunger, but disbelief. A lesser-known detail is that the first year of blight is met with hope. People assume the crop will recover as it has before. Historians still debate how much early optimism delayed effective response. But standing here, you understand how hard it is to imagine catastrophe until it refuses to leave. Hunger changes time. Days stretch. Thoughts narrow. You walk past houses where furniture has been sold. Then tools. Then anything that can be spared. Soup kitchens appear. Crowded and temporary. Relief exists. But it's uneven. Bureaucratic. Often conditional. One widely accepted reality is that Ireland continues exporting food during the famine years. A fact that feels impossible until you see how ownership and policy override need. A strange and bitter detail is how relief schemes sometimes require exhausting labor in exchange for minimal food. As if hunger itself were a moral failure. Historians still argue over whether this suffering results from indifference, ideology, or administrative rigidity, but the effect on the ground is the same. Disease follows hunger closely. You hear coughing, see weakness spread, families thin out, then vanish, graveyards fill quickly, then stop being able to keep up. The silence afterward is unsettling. You feel it most in places that once felt busy, lanes without footsteps, fields without voices. Memory struggles to keep pace with loss. And then there's departure. Ships fill with people who are still alive, which begins to feel like a small mercy. The journey is dangerous, crowded, uncertain. A lesser-known fact is how many emigrants don't see themselves as leaving forever, but as surviving long enough to return. Historians still debate how different Ireland might be if that return had been possible at scale. As the famine grinds on, anger mixes with grief, trust erodes, reform feels abstract when you're hungry. The population drops sharply, not just through death, but through absence. You sense how deeply this emptiness will shape everything that comes after. Ireland will remember this not only as starvation, but as abandonment. You keep walking, slower now, as the land grows quieter and the future rearranges itself around absence. Preparing for a century defined as much by those who left as by those who remained. You notice how the silence doesn't lift even when the famine loosens its grip. It lingers, stretched thin across the countryside, filling the space where people used to be. This is the age of exile across the sea, and it reshapes Ireland just as deeply as starvation did, only more slowly, more quietly. One of the most widely recognized realities of post-famine Ireland is mass emigration. You feel it everywhere. In cottages left to weather. In fields growing wild again. In the way conversations trail off when someone mentions a sibling who never wrote back. You walk toward a port town at dawn. The air smells of salt and coal smoke. Families cluster together, holding what little they can carry. Some are leaving with tickets paid by relatives already abroad. Others have scraped together enough for passage and nothing more. A lesser-known detail is how organized many of these departures become: chain migration, where one person leaves first and others follow years later. Guided by letters and fragile hope, historians still debate whether emigration should be understood primarily as escape, exile, or opportunity. But for the people standing here, it feels like all three at once. The ships themselves are cramped and unforgiving. You imagine the weeks at sea, illness spreading easily, privacy non-existent, fear pressed close. Yet there's also a strange energy on board. Songs are sung, stories are told, people plan lives they can barely picture. A widely accepted fact is that Irish immigrants helped shape cities like New York, Boston, Liverpool, and Sydney, carrying culture with them even as they adapt. A strange and poignant detail is how many bring soil from home, a small attempt to anchor themselves somewhere new. Historians still argue about how consciously Irish identity is preserved abroad versus how much it simply persists out of longing. Back in Ireland, absence becomes normal. Villages learn to function with fewer hands. Marriages are delayed or abandoned. The population keeps falling, even in good years. You sense how this changes ambition itself. Why plan far ahead when the people you love might leave? At the same time, remittances arrive. Money sent home keeps families afloat, funds education, pays rents. The diaspora becomes an invisible part of Ireland's economy and emotional life. There's a quiet transformation in how Ireland sees itself. It's no longer just a place, it's a network. People belong simultaneously to a townland and to somewhere across the ocean. Identity stretches, becoming portable. A lesser-known detail is how Irish political movements begin relying on support from abroad. Especially in America, historians still debate how decisive this external influence is, but it undeniably amplifies voices that might otherwise struggle to be heard. As you move on, you feel a dual pull, toward the future being built elsewhere, and toward the land still holding on here. Ireland is thinner now, but not empty. The people who remain carry memory differently. Shaped by goodbye, you keep walking, steady and reflective, as whispers of change begin to gather again. This time not from hunger or loss, but from ideas sharpened by distance, ready to return home in revolutionary form. You feel the shift before it becomes visible. It's in the way conversations lower their voices, then rise again with purpose. It's in how meetings happen in back rooms, how newspapers are folded just a little too carefully. This is the era of revolutionary whispers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And it grows not from sudden outrage, but from accumulated memory. One of the most widely recognized developments here is the rise of organized nationalist movements. Fueled by cultural revival, political frustration, and the long echo of loss that never quite faded after famine and exile. You walk through a city street where posters announce lectures on language and history. The Gaelic revival is in motion. Irish is being taught, spoken, celebrated, not just as communication, but as resistance. A lesser-known detail is how many revivalists first encountered a sharpened sense of Irish identity abroad, only fully appreciating it after leaving. Historians still debate whether the revival was primarily cultural or political in intent. But in practice, it becomes both. Culture gives people permission to imagine change. Politics tightens alongside it. Parliamentary efforts promise reform, then stall. Home rule bills pass, fail, pass again, and stall again. You feel the fatigue set in. Waiting becomes its own form of pressure. A strange and telling fact is how many people support constitutional reform publicly while quietly preparing for something more decisive. Historians still argue about how widespread support for physical force nationalism truly was before 1916. But the undercurrent is unmistakable. Then comes the Easter Rising. It's brief, dramatic, and initially unpopular. You stand among onlookers confused more than inspired. Buildings are damaged. Leaders are arrested. One widely accepted reality is that public opinion shifts only after the executions begin. The transformation is subtle but powerful. Sympathy grows. Martyrdom reframes failure. A lesser-known detail is how divided the rebels themselves are, ideologically, strategically, emotionally. Historians still debate whether the rising was doomed from the start or necessary precisely because it failed. After that, everything accelerates. Organizations grow. Recruitment surges. The War of Independence unfolds unevenly, ambushes, reprisals. Fear lived daily rather than ceremonially. You sense how intimate this violence is. Fought among neighbors, layered with loyalty and suspicion. At the same time, international attention grows. Ireland's struggle is no longer local, it's being watched, discussed, leveraged. As you move forward, you realize this moment is not just about overthrowing control. It's about redefining legitimacy. Who has the right to rule, to speak, to decide the future? The old patience is gone. In its place is resolve, sharpened by centuries of waiting. You keep walking, steady and quiet, as the path ahead narrows toward a choice that promises freedom but guarantees division. A settlement that will end one struggle and begin another. Carving the island in ways no one fully understands yet. You feel the weight of the decision before it's ever signed. It hangs in rooms thick with smoke and exhaustion, carried in voices that have argued themselves hoarse. This is the moment of partition in the early 1920s. And it doesn't feel like victory so much as compromise wrapped in relief. One of the most widely recognized facts of modern Irish history is the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, which ends the War of Independence and creates the Irish Free State, while leaving 6 counties in the north within the United Kingdom. You stand among people reading the terms again and again, hoping the words will rearrange themselves into something cleaner. They don't. For some, this is freedom long delayed, finally tangible. For others, it's betrayal, unfinished, intolerable. A lesser-known detail is how many supporters of the treaty see it not as an end, but as a stepping stone, an imperfect start that can be built upon. Historians still debate whether the treaty was the best possible outcome given the circumstances, or whether different choices could have avoided what follows. But the sense of fracture is immediate. Violence turns inward. The civil war begins. Bitter and personal, you feel how devastating this is after years of unified resistance. Former comrades face each other across barricades, armed with shared memories and opposing interpretations of the same goal. A strange and painful fact is how short this war is compared to its emotional impact. Historians still argue about how deeply the Civil War shapes Irish political culture. But you can feel its shadow stretching far beyond the battlefield. In the north, partition hardens quickly. Borders that were once abstract become lived reality. Communities find themselves suddenly on the wrong side. Identity tightens, enforced by politics and fear. A lesser-known detail is how provisional many people believe this arrangement will be, expecting revision in years rather than generations. Historians still debate whether partition was intended as permanent or temporary, but permanence has a way of sneaking up on expectations. You walk through towns adjusting to new flags, new laws, new uncertainties. Some people are hopeful, building institutions from scratch. Others are grieving what was lost or divided. Normal life resumes unevenly, shops open, schools function, but tension hums beneath it all, unresolved. As you move forward, you sense that Ireland has entered a different phase of history now. One defined less by foreign rule and more by internal negotiation. Freedom has arrived, but it's incomplete, complicated, and heavy with consequence. You keep walking, steady and reflective, as decades of adaptation, silence, and slow change stretch ahead, preparing the ground for a present that will still be shaped by everything you've just passed through. You arrive in the present without a clear moment of arrival. There's no gate, no announcement. Just a gradual softening of the noise as history stops rushing at you and begins to breathe. This is modern Ireland, shaped less by conquest now and more by memory, negotiation, and the long work of living with consequences. One of the most widely recognized realities of this era is how Ireland, both North and South, spends much of the 20th century learning how to exist after revolution, how to govern, how to disagree, how to remember without constantly reopening wounds. You walk through streets where the past is never far away, but no longer fully in control. In the South, independence solidifies into institutions, sometimes cautious, sometimes stubborn. Economic hardship lingers for decades, followed by moments of sudden growth that feel almost unreal by comparison. A lesser-known detail is how emigration continues even after freedom, driven now by opportunity as much as necessity. Historians still debate whether this outward movement represents unfinished recovery or simply Ireland rejoining global patterns it had been forced into earlier. In the north, the tension you sensed earlier hardens, then eventually fractures. The troubles emerge, not as an explosion, but as a grinding persistence of fear, retaliation, and grief. You feel how exhausting that must be. Generation after generation, A widely accepted turning point is the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, which doesn't erase the past but creates space to stop reliving it daily. A strange and hopeful detail is how much of this piece relies not on certainty, but on deliberate ambiguity, agreements to disagree without violence. Historians still argue about how stable this settlement truly is, but the absence of constant fear matters deeply to those living within it. Culturally, Ireland speaks with confidence now. Music, literature, humor, especially humor, carry centuries of memory lightly, almost playfully. You notice how often the past is referenced casually, no longer as a wound, but as context. The island feels smaller, more connected, yet still distinct, holding onto its voice in a crowded world. And now, as the story finally slows, you realize something gentle. You don't need to carry all of this forward consciously. History has done its work. The land remembers so you don't have to. Your breathing evens out. The images soften, stone circles, ships, fields, voices, all fading into a single, steady rhythm. Nothing is demanding your attention anymore. Just rest now. Let the past drift. Let the present blur. You're safe here, floating quietly at the end of a very long story. End of script. Sweet dreams.